Welcome to Win the Day from Back to the Bible. I'm your coach, Pastor Nat, and today we will talk about God's loving kindness. Times of uncertainty cry out for moments of hope. Years ago, when our youngest son was believed to have a form of epilepsy, our hearts were broken. He was having some unusual episodes, so we took him in for testing. The initial conclusion was he needed to see a specialist. By God's grace, we saw an epileptologist within 2 weeks of the findings. After 5 days in the hospital of constant monitoring, the doctor said, "Your son does not have epilepsy. He is fine." In the midst of our uncertainty, in the midst of our pain, God showed grace several times to our family. The provision of healing was certainly an act of loving kindness. The book of Ruth opens with famine and death. It's a hopeless situation for Naomi and her daughters-in-law. But that was only the beginning of the story. Let's pick it up back in Ruth chapter 1, verse 6 to see what happens next. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." Just like I had a message of hope from the doctor, Naomi received a message of hope from God. She and her daughters-in-law received word that God is providing food. It literally reads, "Given them bread." Now you may remember that the book begins in Bethlehem, which means house of bread. But as you remember, the cupboards were empty, and that's why they left. But now, God has restocked the pantry with bread, so they get up. As soon as she received word of God's provision back home, notice they didn't finish their game of Scrabble. Immediately, they got up and began to walk. What a contrast to how many of us respond to God's grace. We often don't run to it. We finish our tasks and linger in the famine, but not these 3. Now, notice in verse 8 that as they are walking, Naomi says, "You girls go back to your mothers." Why would she say this? It's because as widows, life was tough. It often meant alienation and destitution. It would be even tougher than being Moabites in Judah. So Naomi says, "Whoa, you're not coming with me. It will be better for you to return home and remarry." What we're seeing is a scene of tough love. Then she prays for God's loving kindness to be expressed and received. The word hesed is difficult for us to translate. We translate it as loving kindness. This is a very complex idea. It's God's loving grace upon grace upon grace. It's the combination of His love, mercy, kindness, grace, and overwhelming care. This loving kindness is threefold here. It's a prayer and recognition of God's grace to all His people, the magnitude of His kindness, and the reciprocity of the loving kindness of these women. I'm convinced that God is sovereign over all situations, even in the midst of great trouble and heartache. God's loving kindness is there. The question is, will we see it? Will we share it? So here's my challenge for you today. Ask God to open your eyes to His loving kindness. I'm telling you, it's everywhere, it's all around us. But it's easy to miss it and be slow to respond to it. So look around your life today. Find the Hesed of God. Share it in the comments below. How are you experiencing and seeing God's loving kindness? God's grace is sufficient and extravagant. It's my prayer that we see it and receive it today.